I'm Bill Dorman, Vice President of the Friends of the Library, and I welcome you to the second presentation of the Charles Martel Author Lecture Series. I'm often reminded that life is not an insurance company, but I think it's safe in guaranteeing that no one is likely to doze off today with our speaker. Before we get underway, I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Sacramento State Retirees Association, the University Bookstore, Sacramento State Creative Services, the CSUS Library, of course, the dean is with us somewhere hiding, and the Library Gallery, which regularly provides our venue. There's another special group of sponsors, co-sponsors, that I'd like to thank, and that would be the membership of the Friends of the Library, without whose assistance, generosity, beneficence, did I get most of it? Yes. Without which we wouldn't exist. We couldn't bring speakers to you at all. At the end of the presentation today, I want to remind you that books will be on sale at the rear of the room, and the author will happily sign them. Now to the matter at hand. The extraordinary physicist, Madame Marie Curie, once said something that I think we would do well to remember in these troubled times of our political history. She said, "Nothing in life is to be feared. It is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more so that we may fear less." In my considered judgment, I can think of no better way to pursue such understanding than by reading our speaker's book, Jumping at Shadows, The Triumph of Fear and the End of the American Dream. I base that judgment on my 4 decades of university teaching and scholarship in the areas of journalism, politics, public opinion, and propaganda. The author, in my view, brings to his task a brilliance that is unmistakable and a breadth of knowledge that is astonishing. And because of his skill as a writer, the very real bonus for his readers is that he adds a literary quality to his work that is impressive as it is uncommon. I can also add that on the basis of having had the privilege of hearing him speak a number of times, that he is every bit as good a speaker as he is a writer. So may I introduce Sasha Abramsky.
Well, thank you for that extraordinarily generous introduction. And thank you to the Friends of the Library for putting on this event tonight and today and hosting me yet again in this wonderful university. And of course to all of you for choosing to spend some time discussing these issues with me today. So I was asked to give a speech on the political moment we were in, or are in. And we decided to time it for after the elections. Now I promise you I will get to those elections because, they're obviously quite important. But I'm going to back my way in, and I'm going to talk about the political moment we're in first, and then why what happened on Tuesday was so absolutely important. Now, I don't think I'm telling anyone here anything they don't already know when I say that we are in an utterly perilous political moment, and that we are seeing unleashed in America a violent ethno-nationalism, a nativism, being whipped up from the White House itself that threatens to render apart the fabric of this country. The nativism, the embrace of the word nationalism, is reshaping our country and reshaping by extension the broader world we are a part of, not just around issues of immigration, not just around issues of race, but across a whole range of politics, of policies, and of behaviors. And as this nativism intensifies, we are seeing a shredding of civility. We are seeing an attack on the notion that one can exist while peacefully disagreeing with people. And in seeing those norms of civility shattered, we are witnessing the birth of something extraordinarily dangerous in American society. Now, in the Trump era, the news cycle speeds up so much that what happens yesterday seems the distant past, what happens a week ago seems the distant, distant past, what happens 2 weeks ago, that's so far past we can't even remember it. So let me just spend a few minutes refreshing all of our minds, reminding of what has happened just in the last 2.5, 3 weeks in American politics. We saw more than a dozen pipe bombs sent through the mail to Trump's political opponents, to men and women who had been repeatedly demonized at these massive propaganda-filled rallies. We saw the slaughter by a Nazi sympathizer of 11 Jewish worshippers in a synagogue in Pittsburgh. We saw the shootings of African Americans in Kentucky by a racial supremacist. We have seen immigrants described by the President of the United States, a man with the single biggest reach on earth, as invaders. And in response to that putative invasion of desperate, hungry, diseased, impoverished children and their parents, we have seen the deployment of 5,000 heavily armed US military personnel to the border. The deployment on American soil in defiance of the posse comitatus of soldiers who have been told by the President of the United States that if refugees and asylum seekers throw rocks at them, they are to regard that as an attempt on their lives and respond with lethal force. In the wake of the soldiers going down there, we see hundreds of heavily armed militia members coming in from all parts of the country because they believe they have been called to defend the US border by the Commander-in-Chief. We have seen the increased construction and the promise to further increase the construction of quote-unquote tent cities to indefinitely detain would-be migrants. There's another phrase for tent cities because tent cities have been used before. They've been used in Germany at a certain point in time. They were used by the British in the Boer War. There's another word for tent cities. It's called internment camps. Japanese Americans experienced internment camps in World War II. It is a reality we never, ever should allow our country to return to. So now that we're in the business of our US government advocating the construction of concentration camps, according to the Commander-in-Chief, those camps will house not just adults, but children as well, despite the fact there is a law in place, a settlement in place called the Flores Settlement, that specifically prohibits the government from indefinitely detaining children. Also in the last 2 weeks, Donald Trump has promised that with an executive action, he will sign an order ending birthright citizenship. Let's ponder this a moment. We used to worry that a Republican getting in charge would pose a threat to the Great Society. And then we started worrying that a Republican getting in charge would pose a threat to the New Deal. Now, apparently, we have to worry that with the current administration, we're not just rolling back the 20th century, we're rolling back the entire post-Civil War American fabric. Because if you end birthright citizenship, you have to do so by overturning the 14th Amendment. And lest anyone forget, the 14th Amendment is a foundational principle guaranteeing African Americans birth citizenship. So if you go after undocumented immigrants and you turn them into a scapegoat for all of the problems facing America, and you say, I'm going to illegally end birthright citizenship, you are putting at stake the entire fabric of the last 150 years of American history. Trump has said he will use national security arguments to bar from entry into the country all Central Americans. Now, on the surface, that's an absolutely absurd claim to make. It's as absurd as saying that I can use national security arguments to ban people from 7 Muslim majority nations. The only problem is he got away with that because the Supreme Court upheld his travel ban. All of this has happened in the last 2 weeks. So now let's go back a bit to the last 2 years. And I promise you I won't multiply this by 100. We'll keep this a little bit shorter. Over the last 2 years, an extraordinary range of Americans have faced attack from an increasingly malign and dangerous federal government. 800,000 DACA recipients have lived in desperate insecurity and fear throughout the Trump presidency because time and time and time again, the administration has tried to roll back what little legal protections those young men and women have. 500,000 people who have settled in this country under temporary protected status provisions from El Salvador, from Honduras, from Nicaragua, from the Sudan, from a range of other countries, have been told by the government over the last couple of years to pack their bags and leave. And those hundreds of thousands of people who have lived here with legal status for decades have hundreds of thousands of US-born citizen children. And those children, if their parents are deported, will face the following choice. Either return to a country they have never been to, of which they are not citizens, go back to Honduras, El Salvador, or wherever, face the daily perils of countries with failed economies, controlled by some of the most ruthless gangs on earth, go back with their parents to that, or stay in this country effectively orphaned while their parents are returned to homes thousands of miles away. Now, thankfully, California's courts have stepped in and for now at least said to the federal government, you cannot capriciously roll back temporary protected status. But again, for those 500,000 adults and their roughly 500,000 US citizen children, a vast and ongoing crisis of fear has been their lot in the Trump era. The same holds for members of the LGBT community, which is facing one attack after another on their legal status, their protections, their civil liberties, and even the most pernicious small things, like the banning of same-sex partners from diplomats working in the United States. Now, who does that? Who wakes up in the morning and says, I am going to try to find a particularly obscure provision in the US Immigration Code to ban a few dozen same-sex partners of diplomats from entering the country? I would guess it was Mike Pence, but that's just my guess. Who else is facing a threat under Trump's America? Well, if you are a Muslim American, or you are a Muslim hoping to visit or migrate into America, you face the sustained assault of this government. You face an assumption of guilt. You face racial and religious demagoguing. You face a government which has made it clear it regards you as a domestic enemy. Who else has faced attack over the last 2 years? Well, the single biggest group facing attack at the moment are legal immigrants. Not undocumented immigrants, but legal immigrants here with all of the required legal paperwork, who are now being told that the government has changed the way it calculates whether or not you are, quote unquote, a public charge. Now, there are laws on the books going back to the 19th century. And those laws say if you come into the country and you're deemed to be a public charge, you're deemed to be somebody particularly likely to end up reliant on cash welfare benefits, that can be used as denial of entry. That's been on the books since the 19th century. It's been interpreted the same way for 130 years. And it's always been interpreted to exclude the usage of medical services and of nutritional programs. Not out of any great humanitarian impulse, but simply out of self-interest. If you have millions of immigrants in a country, you want them to be immunized so they're not a public health risk. If they're elderly, you want them to be able to get affordable prescription drugs. If they temporarily lose their job, you don't want them to starve. If their children come to school, you want them to be fed, because hungry children don't concentrate in the classroom. It makes sense out of self-interest to access those programs for immigrants. Well, Trump, in the last few months, has redefined public charge. Now, if you're a legal immigrant and you or your children access medical services, or you're elderly, you access Medicare Part D to pay for prescription drugs, or you temporarily fall in hard times and you access food stamps, now you are subject to losing your green card. Think about that. What kind of government deliberately crafts a policy designed to make people hungrier and designed to make people sicker? Which is why I say the moment we are in is a truly insane moment. We are the world's most diverse country. We're one of the most diverse countries in human history. At this moment, there are 43 million immigrants living in the United States of America. And those 43 million immigrants have tens of millions of children. And yet the most diverse, pluralistic country on this planet is sliding into white ethno-nationalist governance. And as it does so, we are seeing this absurd, grotesque situation where a minority, not a majority, a minority of residents locks into place their political advantage because of the way the Electoral College works and the way the US Senate works. And in locking into place their political advantage, they lock into place their control over the judiciary and the legal system. And the more they control politics and the more they control the legal process, the more they are able to use that advantage to strip other Americans, their neighbors, their friends, their colleagues, their co-workers, their co-religionists. The more they are able to use that to strip these other Americans of their basic economic and participatory status. The great essayist Rebecca Solnit explained it this way in a recent essay in the UK newspaper The Guardian. She said that in a meaningful way, Trump's presidency is the first Confederate presidency of the United States. So let me backtrack a bit. How on earth did we get here? And this comes to what I was trying to explain in my book, Jumping at Shadows. There are some big picture trends that are long-term, and there are some that are short-term. But here are the long-term trends. For the last 50 years, almost without exception, year in, year out, we have become a more economically unequal country. Since the Nixon era, year in, year out, doesn't matter if it's a Democrat or Republican in the White House, the rich have got richer and the poor have got poorer, and the middle has become more precarious. And the rich have used their political advantage very well to reshape tax codes so that richer people pay less in taxes. Well, if you're paying less into the tax pool, there's less money to spend on poorer people and social programs. And as society has become more unequal, a whole bunch of bad things have happened. People have lost access to pensions. They've lost access, in many cases, to paid benefits. Before the Affordable Care Act went in, more and more people were going bankrupt because of medical bills. Housing became more unaffordable for more and more and more people. And even in the years when unemployment was down, for example, this year or last year, economic insecurity continued to be high because so many jobs that are being created pay only subsistence wages. Well, if you increase inequality, you increase anxiety. And if you increase anxiety, you make people prey to a scapegoating politics because people become more ready to look for villains. Why am I poor? Why am I homeless? Why am I struggling? Oh, it's their fault. It's the fault of the Muslims or the Mexicans or the young black men or the drug addicts or the gays. Pick your choice, pick your scapegoat. If you increase inequality the way we have, you create all the conditions for a scapegoating, fear-based, anxious political moment. Now, tied in with inequality, we saw something else happen. From the 70s on in, especially in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, America reinvented itself as a mass incarceration society. What does this have to do with fear? I'm glad there's an ironic laugh I'm hearing in the room, because you guys understand the issues. If you convince enough people that society is becoming more and more dangerous, that there are super predators, quote unquote, roaming around, that there are drug dealers ready to sell drugs to your young kids on every street corner, and that the only solution is to lock up more and more and more people, and if you're pushing that kind of politics, or if you're in the local media markets and you realize that TV news sells if it's gory and bloody, if it bleeds, it leads, you have all the incentives to hype up fear. Now, I was a young journalist back in the early 1990s. I started writing a lot about crime and punishment because one of the things I realized was in real time we were witnessing a revolution. It was a very bad revolution. It was a revolution that was turning America into the single biggest incarceration nation on earth. Bigger than China, which has 5 times our population. We went from having a comparable incarceration rate to, let's say, England or France or most other Western democracies, to having an incarceration rate, that's the number per 100,000 of the population, 5 times higher than any of our peer nations. If we had an incarceration rate comparable to America or Canada, comparable to England or Canada or Germany or Sweden or anything else, a country this size would have about 400,000 prisoners. By the early 2000s, we had over 2 million prisoners. Disproportionately young, disproportionately black and brown, disproportionately undereducated. We were using our prison system as a form of carceral welfare. Now, one of the things that happens as you expand a prison system, in addition to creating this vast underclass of the incarcerated and the formerly incarcerated, you create a vast number of people whose jobs and whose livelihoods are tied in with incarceration. You've created an incentive to dehumanize entire groups of people because nobody wants to work in a prison and think they're dealing with other vulnerable human beings. It's much easier to work in a prison and think you're dealing with monsters. And so as we made prisons a central part of our economy, we increasingly created the conditions to dehumanize the other, whether it was a racial minority or an economic minority. So now we have 2 parts of the problem: widening economic inequality combined with a prison culture that dehumanizes. A bunch of other things also go into the mix here. For 20 plus years, everybody, Democrats, Republicans, members of the House of Representatives, senators, presidents, lawyers, pretty much everyone who studied the issue says immigration system's broken. We need fundamental reforms. And one of those reforms is we need to find a way, pathways to citizenship and to stability for the millions upon millions of people living in the shadows without paperwork. And in those years, we have failed time and time and time again to deal with immigration. And we have allowed the crisis to grow, and we have allowed demagogues to take charge of the narrative and to demonize immigrants as dangerous, as predatory, as exploitative, as here to take our hard-earned tax dollars and our jobs. And as we have demonized immigrants, we have created all the conditions for an explosion in American nationalism, or ethno-nationalism, or alt-right, or whatever the term of the moment might be. And the final thing I'll add into the mix here, long-term, is environmental degradation. It doesn't matter whether or not you believe in climate change, though how anyone can not believe in climate change is beyond me at this point. But regardless of whether or not you consciously believe in climate change, pretty much everybody feels anxious about the world. They feel that it's too crowded, they feel that it's too fast, they feel it's too polluted, they feel the storms are growing too big, they feel that fires are out of control. There is a sense of anxiety around environmental degradation. And all of this feeds into a mix, a feeling of endemic, permanent anxiety and fear and insecurity. A feeling that things are going off the rails, a feeling that we have lost control of our destiny. And you can see this. You can see it on the ground. And one of the wonderful things for me about being a journalist is I have an excuse to go all over the country and to talk to people, not just famous people. Famous people are boring. Famous people tell you nothing because they're polished. But if you go into a community where people have never talked to a journalist before, where people are just so happy someone is there to listen to their stories, you hear these extraordinary things. You hear these life stories about the way people are treated, or the fears they have, or the hopes they have. And I've had the enormous privilege over 2.5 decades now of going and talking to people about their anxieties. What does it feel like if you get up in the morning, you don't know how you're going to feed your kids that evening? And I've spoken to hundreds of people on food lines around the country. What does it feel like knowing that law enforcement is targeting you because of the color of your skin? What does it feel like being so twisted into a bundle of fear and anxiety because every single day you click on your Facebook page and you see one horror story after another horror story about child kidnappings and bomb attacks going off and shark attacks and God knows what else, but doom and gloom stories, one after the other after the other. When I was writing my book, Jumping at Shadows, one of the events, scenes that I can't get out of my head because it was so absurd on one level and yet spoke to the moment so much on another, was a school I visited outside Salt Lake City in Utah. It was a Montessori preschool, and I'm a parent. I have 2 kids, and I know a little bit about why you send your kids to different kinds of schools. And usually it's to do with the educational philosophy. And Montessori schools, usually you send your kids to a Montessori school because you like the sort of liberal arts aspect of it. You like the fact they have kids drawing instead of taking tests all the time. You like the fact that maybe there's some music being taught. Maybe you like the fact that it isn't so rigid in its educational philosophy about exactly when you have to learn to read or to learn mathematics or whatever it might be. That's why people mostly look for a Montessori preschool. Except in this place in Salt Lake City, the school had realized something, and it had realized that the single biggest selling point was nothing to do with the educational philosophy. It was to do with the security systems they had in place. And so I went to this school because it was marketing itself for having these massively secure entry points. You had to scan your thumbprints and various other things just to get into the building. And then once you were in the building, there was a bank of computer panels in the front area because every single classroom was being live streamed in. So you could stand in the hallway and make sure that the teachers weren't abusing your children. And then inside the classrooms, every single teacher had been given anti-bear spray. This was before Trump started about arming teachers with weapons. But they'd been given anti-bear spray just in case an attacker came in. And then in the playground, and this was where I really got upset, in the playground, any of you who've been outside Salt Lake City, you know there's beautiful mountains there. It's on the edge of the Wasatch Mountain Range. It's one of the most epic scenes on earth. Except those kids couldn't see that epic scene because they had a 20-foot wall surrounding their playground. And all of this was being marketed to parents who were extraordinarily scared. And I sat down and I talked with them, and I said to some of them, because some of them had criminal justice degrees, and I said, look, you got to know the statistics. You know crime rates are about a quarter, violent crime rates, of what they were 25 years ago. And some of them said, yeah, we know that intellectually, but we see so much violence on Facebook and on local news, and we can't get it out of our heads. And so there was this disjunct between what they intellectually knew and what was going on emotionally. And the thing is, if you are exposed to fear imagery often enough, your brain responds in almost the same way as if you were actually exposed to fear itself. It doesn't really matter if it's a secondary or a primary exposure to fear. Our fear impulses and our fear responses are as hardwired into us neurologically as any set of behavioral traits that we have. And they're ancient responses. These aren't just things we picked up as a species in the last 5,000 or 10,000 years. These go back hundreds of millions of years to the reptilian, the limbic parts of the brain. The reason for that is pretty straightforward. In the wild, in a state of nature, you don't survive as a species if you don't have a finely tuned fear response. You don't survive as a species if a predator is about to attack you and your body doesn't instantly armor up. Not in a minute or 2 minutes or 5 minutes, but in milliseconds. So what happens when you're exposed to fear? Your body is flooded with a whole host of chemicals. Now, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not going to pretend to talk you through all of it, but I know that 2 of the chemicals are adrenaline and cortisol. And what they do is they armor your body up. Your heartbeat speeds up, your blood pressure increases, you pump blood to your muscles so your muscles actually physically harden. Your eyes lose their ability to have peripheral focus because you're intent on focusing on what's ahead of you, that risk immediately in front of you. And it kicks in the fight, flight, or freeze response. And these are ancient animal responses to fear. We still have those responses. If you're walking in the woods, and you see what you think's a snake in front of you, your whole body goes into this fear panic mode. You can feel it. You jump back, your heartbeat increases, and then you look down, turns out it's just a stick. You feel a bit sheepish, but just because you feel sheepish, you can't instantly turn off the fear response because you've got all that adrenaline coursing through you. It takes a while to calm down again. Well, if secondary responses can trigger similar responses, then we got a problem. Because we evolved to deal with saber-toothed tigers and other predators. We didn't evolve to deal with saturation imagery on Facebook or on local television news. But if our bodies and our minds respond the same way, when we're continually bombarded with images of crime or images of terrorism or images of dangerous young men, we respond physiologically and psychologically as if we are being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger. And one of the things that happens is we lose our ability to think with nuance. We do the same thing to our mind as to what fear does to our eyesight when it shuts down peripheral vision. In a moment of fear, we want certainty. Doesn't matter if the certainty is nonsense, we just want somebody to say, I will make things right. And this is where we come back to Donald Trump and the perils of absolute demagogy. Because Trump's evil genius, and I do believe he's not simply a buffoon, Trump's evil demagogic methodology is if you stoke enough fear, then people will turn to a strong man for answers. If you make people scared enough of destitute immigrants fleeing drug gangs, they will tolerate internment camps. If you make people scared enough about MS-13 and other gangs infiltrating suburban America, they will tolerate a clampdown on refugees. If you make people scared enough about brown people committing acts of terrorism, they will tolerate travel bans, even though by orders of magnitude, more people are being killed at the moment by angry, young, white men here in the States, as we saw last night in Southern California, who have been given access to military-grade weaponry. Trump's methodology has nothing to do with actually tackling complicated problems. It has everything to do with using fear to manipulate public audiences so they will do a strong man's bidding. Now, the danger of this is that we see in what Trump is doing a collapse in rational discourse. We see in Trump's doing the fragmenting into tribes of a society of 330 million people. And in those tribes, we lose common notions of what holds us together, right down to the fact that Trump is stirring so much suspicion of science, of the media, and of expertise in general, that we are losing our ability to come to a common understanding of what's true and what's false. We are fragmenting into tribes around where we get our news, around where we get our entertainment, around who we regard as a friend and who we regard as an enemy. Now, the problem is that this transcends America, because America's footprint is so large, America's cultural input is so large, that when America goes down this road, the rest of the world is in danger of following. And we've seen that in Italy with the emergence to power of neo-fascists. We've seen it in Brazil, most tragically, where the second biggest country in the hemisphere voted in somebody who's an out-and-out fascist. We've seen it in one country after another in the last few years. The emergence of what I'm going to call a new populist barbarism, where walls replace the open society, where blood and soil politics becomes the norm, where the marginalized are no longer treated as needing and deserving our respect and the support of social services, but are seen as being dangerous and are seen as being legitimate targets for our fears. Now, the language of universalism is probably the most important political language of the last 200 years. The language of universalism is what the Enlightenment era is founded upon. You take away the language of universalism, you take away the language of human rights, you take away the language of universal human decency, and you are left with nothing but a totalitarian political project. And we've seen that before. There's nothing new in what Trump's doing, except he's using new medium. He's using Twitter instead of the film reel. He's using text messaging instead of the propaganda poster. But we've seen it before. We saw it in fascist Europe. We saw it in the Stalinist Soviet Union. We know what happens when a totalitarian project takes off. And it is always ugly. And it is always violent. And it is always coarsening. We know this. We know exactly what is at the end of the dark road that Trump is leading this country down. So, that's the doom and gloom. But I was asked to come here and talk about the election. And so, I'm going to spend just a few minutes before I open it up to questions talking about the election. There is an upside to this. The upside to what is happening in America at the moment is that we are seeing a rebirth of civic energies and a rebirth of civic engagement and a rebirth of the idea that decency matters in a way we have not seen in this country for decades. Especially amongst young people, people are realizing there is no margin for error here. And there is no room to sit this one out and to pretend not to care. And from one state to the next, we are seeing grassroots groups coming out. I was up in Washington earlier this year with the people who are campaigning for an initiative called 1631 to tackle climate change. Now, 1631 failed on Tuesday by a small margin, but it energized tens of thousands of environmentalists and social justice and economic justice advocates all around the state of Washington, not just in the big cities, but in the rural north, on Native American reservations, all over the state. People came to fight for economic and environmental justice. A few months later, I went to North Carolina, to Appalachian counties in the western part of the state, where there's a group called Down Home North Carolina that is knocking on doors, not just by the dozens, but by the thousands, and is picking up volunteers everywhere it goes. And it's doing so by talking about the minimum wage, talking about access to health care, talking about job security, talking about pensions, talking about treatment for opioid addiction. Things that matter to not just white people, not just black people, not just brown people, but to people, full stop. We are seeing a universalism reemerge on the ground to fight for America's soul. Now, let's come to the election on Tuesday. The downside is the Senate stayed Republican and went slightly more red. But don't let Trump fool you. When Trump spins that as a great electoral victory, it is the single most hollow victory you could imagine. Because the Senate, if anyone has ever studied civics in this country, I'm sure you all have here, you'll know it is structurally utterly anti-democratic with a small d. Because if you're in Wyoming with just under 600,000 residents, you have 70 times the per-person representation in the US Senate as a Californian has. 70 times. California and New York between them have about 60 million residents, and yet they only have 4 US senators between them. So the fact that a few conservative rural states, which between them have maybe 1/5 of California's population, the fact that a few rural red states overturned some blue senators doesn't mean a victory for Republican ideals, and it certainly doesn't mean a victory for Trumpism. Because if you want to know what happened on Tuesday night, you have to look at the great groundswell across this country, where 114 million people, more than 30 million more than in the 2014 midterms, came out to vote, and by huge margins chose a language of inclusivity over a language of fear. And I'm going to very quickly run down why I think you can make that argument. The House of Representatives was utterly gerrymandered after 2010. And it was gerrymandered in a way the Republicans thought they could almost guarantee that they would never lose a majority. It was gerrymandered so that they could withstand a 6% loss in the public vote and still retain a GOP majority. And they didn't retain a GOP majority, which tells you how many people came out to oppose that agenda. Perhaps more importantly, if you look at what happened in state initiatives, a vast number of really important measures passed. And the single biggest one is in Florida. Now, 20 years ago, I started writing about felon disenfranchisement. And at the time, nobody paid any attention to the issue. It was seen as this obscure thing that just sort of happened to disenfranchise 5 million Americans. And for 20 years, I've been writing about this. Florida has this massive problem of permanent disenfranchisement because in an era of mass incarceration and mass prosecution, the numbers go up and up and up and up. If you permanently disenfranchise and every year you're putting more people behind bars and giving more people felony records, you end up with a huge percentage of your electorate who can't vote. And by this year, it was 10% of the over 18 population in Florida. 1.5 million people couldn't vote in that state because of a felony record. And the Republican governor there, Rick Scott. It's been a long day. The Republican governor there, who has Scott in his name somewhere, had systematically refused to re-enfranchise. And finally, a campaign picked up enough momentum, it could put an initiative on the ballot. And on Tuesday night, 64% of Floridians voted to re-enfranchise their fellow citizens. If you look elsewhere in this country, in Idaho, in Utah, in Nebraska, 3 of the most conservative states in the country, voters voted to expand Medicaid so that more of their neighbors and friends and colleagues could get access to health care. In Michigan, voters rejected the war on drugs and what it was doing to community, and they legalized marijuana. In several other states, voters decided that gerrymandering was unhealthy for a democracy. So they voted to limit the ability of politicians to gerrymander. In Massachusetts, voters voted to protect transgendered rights. In several cities and states, voters voted to uphold sanctuary laws, saying that they did not believe that their state governments and state agencies should be cooperating with ICE to deport their neighbors. And all of this gives hope. Because the project Trump is trying to impose on this country, if it succeeds, will absolutely reshape who we are as a people and what our values are and how we relate to the rest of the world and how the world relates to us, not just for the next 2 or 3 years, but for generations. If Trump succeeds, he will remake this country in the nastiest, most brutalist way imaginable. And Americans on Tuesday rejected that. Now, that doesn't mean the game's over. It doesn't mean Trump has lost. But it does mean we have the wind at our back. And it does mean that over the next few years, we have to take that momentum and build on it. What we cannot do is assume that because 2018 produced a fairly good election result, that now we can sit back, that now we can return to normal. Because if we make that mistake, Trump will run roughshod in the next couple years. If, on the other hand, we say 2018 is a starting point, and over the next years, bit by bit and step by step, we resist and we take this country back, then we will take this country back, because there is force in numbers, and there are more of us than there are of those who support Trump and his narrow vision. And that's where I'm going to stop, and that's where you're going to start. Thank you very much.